and bring the power of your mind and the power of your understanding, the power of your knowledge as an offering to a suffering world.
Dr. Robert Moore cuts through the noise to reveal our urgent need for a psychospiritual arc, to hold the overwhelming force of grandiosity. He challenges a culture that profits from suffering and flips the call to care on its head. At the heart of this lecture is dragon energy, a raw, godlike power inside us all that demands respect and containment. Moore guides us through the psyche's landscape, from Freud's chaos to Jung's radiant self, and shows why building a strong inner vessel is essential to channel this energy without breaking. He invites us to practice presence, engage with dreams, and meet our inner dragons with empathy and fierce commitment. This is Building the Psychospiritual Arc, part of the 2014 conference, Coping with Grandiosity in Our Lives, the deity and the dragon inside us, recorded in San Antonio, Texas.
Well, I'm not going to tell you that if you really think about that song, you wouldn't need my lecture tomorrow night. But I appreciate your coming tonight. My plan was to so distill this material so that it was about 190 proof like white lightning. But I figured that I would not succeed. My goal is really maybe something like the best Texas vodka Tito's, which I'd like to kind of be somewhere in that zip code. And I'll just tell you, last night, you know, we had to prune a lot off of what I was going to say, and I'll just tell you just a couple of things that I would have done had I had more time. First of all, I intended to read passages from Isaiah 24, Matthew 24, and 25, because I wanted to lift up the reigning spirit of triage in our time. I don't know how many of you know what that is. It's triage. Well, instead of inclusive caring, triage always writes off those who are really seriously close to death. And it doesn't attend to those who are going to survive. And it simply concentrates on those, all the energy on those that might make it. But it's not, it doesn't come out of abundance. You know, it doesn't come out of abundance. And the spirit of triage, not the spirit of, the royal spirit of inclusive caring is in the air and the spirit of the age. And I will hope to be able to lay that out more for you some other time. The key thing I would just say, for you to reflect on those passages, and I meant to unfold this thought, that greed has turned Matthew 25 upside down in this world. We have been farming the sick, the medical and pharmaceutical industry farming the sick. The prison industrial complex has been farming the prisoners, and so on. But I've got to move on because I've got a lot more to try to shoehorn in here tonight. So I want to just start off by saying, this is going to be complex and intense, even in the short time I have. And so I want us to just keep a sense of humor, because there's no way I could be able to expect you to let all this in at one time. As I said, I think I may have said in the question and answer period last night, too much information shuts us down. So I just want you to grin at me. You know, I want you to smile at me when you're feeling like your system is about to shut down because there's too much, okay? Because we need to approach all this with a sense of humor. You know, tomorrow night I'll comment a bit about the relationship between humor and spiritual enlightenment. So I appreciate your smiling and maybe laughing to keep it light because this is heavy, okay? So I'm gonna get started here. Now this material, for those of you that have read my Facing the Dragon book, all of the stuff I'm sharing with you these 3 evenings really is material taken from us of a series of books. I haven't decided yet whether it's going to be a 3-book series or a quartet of books yet. But it's all this work that I've been working on, and it's gotten very close to being edited. That's my task in the next year. And it's Facing the Dragon was the first book in this series. Understanding the Dragon is what we're talking about tonight. And Loving the Dragon, a combination of Loving the Dragon, the Golden Dragon, and the Fellowship of the Dragon, I'm taking those I'll be talking about tomorrow night. Okay? So there's a lot of stuff that I'm trying to get in here, and so let's just keep a sense of humor. I'll take a shot at it, and then you'll have access to this stuff anyway. For those of you who haven't had a chance to look at that Facing the Dragon book, that was my attempt to give a very quick synopsis of what we have learned through the best in psychoanalysis of different schools about the role that this grandiose energy plays in the psyche. Now, as I said to you last night, you know, I've done a lot of study of comparative psychotherapeutic and theoretical systems, and if I were to be honest, I would tell you I've probably had more psychotherapy than any other living human being. And I'm proof that it doesn't always, the magic doesn't always work. But I'm not kidding you. I've been analyzed by Freudians. I have an Adlerian psychoanalytic diploma, which I got before I became a Jungian analyst. I was analyzed by Rogerians, by Gestaltists. I'm serious. It's funny. It's funny, and so on, and all of them helped me. I was better. I believe in psychotherapy. I believe it's something that we ought to actually get serious about making available to people that can't afford it, which is most folks, right? And so you need to understand, I believe in psychotherapy, and there's a lot of proof now that it really helps. Even though the drug companies are trying to convince everybody that medication alone will do it all. That's a lie. Medication is another triage. Now, everybody that needs it ought to take it. I believe in the partnership of medication and good psychotherapy, and that research shows that's the combination works best on serious problems. But let me just give you. What I'm going to do is just. I'm going to make a lot of grandiose comments now. Let's just keep a sense of humor. Okay, so a lot of these therapies help. You know, Rogerian, ego psychologies, cognitive psychotherapy is real popular now. You know, helping you clean up your thinking. You know, like our folks in AA, you know what they say, stinking thinking. well, he's right about that. A lot of our problems can be transformed if we just confront our stinking thinking, and what our Buddhist friends call the monkey mind. So there's no question about that. But I'm here to tell you tonight that the psychoanalytic tradition from George Grodek, Freud's teacher, who he got the concept of the it from, was the pioneer. George Grodek, G-R-O-D-D-E-C-K. He was the first predecessor of my thinking on the reality of the big it in the psyche. Freud took that from Grodek and came up with his idea of the it, the id. Freud had made a big discovery there. And that is to say, and I'm talking about classical Freudians, not psychoanalytic ego psychologist Freudians. That is, Freud knew, and on his deathbed, he reaffirmed that the most important fact in the psyche is the power of the it, the power of the big it, the id. I'm not going to go a lot into the Freud's discovery, but just to say this, in the Facing the Dragon book, I just lay out the way that Freudians, Adlerians, Jungians, and the Kohutians, the Heinz Kohut tradition, each one of those significant systems of thought pointed to the reality of a psychological phenomenon, an active psychological phenomenon in the unconscious, usually in the unconscious. Sadly, usually unconscious, but that thinks it's God, acts like it thinks it's God. In Freud, it was the it, the ID, the id in Freud's therapy simply is a fancy Latin translation that is not what it was in the German. In the German, it was das Es, which means the it. The it. And so what's the key thing about the it in Freud? Well, it has voracious appetites. And it has an aggressive, invasive energy that is always trying to kick in the door of your conscious subjectivity. Now, I want you to think about that a minute. According to Freud, your anxiety, the great deal of your anxiety that comes from inside, there's anxiety that comes at us from the outer world, but it's not nearly as problematic as the pressure of the big it on the doors of your psyche. I can say a true thing here. Everybody in this room, if I put my Freud hat on, everybody in this room is continuing to be assailed from within by the pressure of this thing that thinks it's God. And that generates the vast majority of your toxic anxiety. And the whole of Freud's thinking is that your ego defenses, denial is an example. Your ego, according to Freud, it is sneaky. It will do anything to protect the conscious mind from being overwhelmed by the it. And what does that mean? And this is something that Jungians should not have jettisoned from Freud. The ego is a trickster, and part of its purpose in Freud is to lie. And why does it need to lie? It's very simple. Because if it did not lie, you would get psychotic. Remember what I was talking about last night. I mean, if you were to come to full consciousness of the power of the it, you would melt. You'd melt down. I mean that. This is accurate reading of Freud. Not Freudians today. They have thrown away his insight, and they've become ego psychologists. Part of my message tonight, I want you to have before you go away, is that I don't think any ego psychologies really work. Not finally. Not in terms of dealing with the problem of the big thing in the psyche that's grandiose. The psychoanalytic tradition picked this thing up on its radar. And Alfred Adler, you know, there were the big three. Sigmund Freud, Alfred Adler, Carl Jung. And there were a bunch of other very gifted people in that circle, in those circles. But Alfred Adler, his fundamental premise was that behind every inferiority complex is a hidden superiority complex. In other words, if you're low in self-esteem, and Alfred Adler was doing therapy with you, he would try to, with humor, he would try to trick you into having to admit that you organize your world hierarchically, that you seek to dominate others with power. What is neurosis, mental illness for Adler? It's organizing your world vertically, with your foot on somebody else's neck, and your hope that you want to be the king or queen of the mountain. That was Adler's view of psychopathology. So, what was his understanding of how you get healed? Well, you got to stop organizing your world vertically in terms of how much better you are or I am than others, and to create a community feeling. Create loving feelings toward those around you. So the key thing in Adler, though, is the superiority complex. That's the hidden unconscious claim to superiority and entitlement. So that's Alfred Adler's psychology in a nutshell. Carl Jung was the revolutionary breakthrough. Some few years ago, I was privileged to speak to the national conference of Jungian analysts in Chicago. And I chose the topic, Theory Matters, because it really matters whether or not you get that there is a big thing in your psyche. You can be a Freudian, you can be an Adlerian, you can be a Jungian, or you can be the more recent person, Heinz Kohut, and psychoanalytic self-psychology. Each one of them in their own way recognized this grandiose thing in the psyche that acts like it thinks it's God. Jung was the one who brought, I told them, the Copernican revolution in psychology, because he made much more clear than Freud had ever understood, much more clear than Adler had ever understood, that there's not one center of consciousness, the ego, the I, but Jung got it, that there, in the classical Jungian theory, that is, Jung and his disciple, outstanding analyst, Edward Edinger, there is the archetypal self, which is the big center, the sun in the unconscious. There's a sun in the unconscious that shines all the time and never goes out. That's Jung's stand. It is radically different and much more clear than any other psychological system. And we can never go back, because of his gift of his Copernican revolution, to understand that the ego is the center of subjectivity. The I that's looking at me now, that's the ego consciousness. And Jung understood the ego as sort of the center of your subjectivity, your conscious mind. But he was very clear, and this was the first time in history, and subsequently, nobody, there's all these people that talk about being post-Jungians. I have to resist laughing at the folks that think that they've now can throw out Jung, because that's a little intellectual arrogance in my view. So Jung set things straight. The ego is not the center of the psyche. The archetypal self is the central sun in the psyche, from which all of this dragon energy that I talk about in my books comes from. The reason I've chosen to call it dragon energy is because there's this real interesting tendency in us humans, and that is, if we use a concept very much, we get to the point that we trivialize it. This is true about the way people have talked about the archetypal self, Jung's archetypal self. Most Jungians now seem not to remember the radical nature of Jung's breakthrough, and they've set it aside. Many of them, many Jungian analysts, people with diplomas from well-known institutes, many of them now have turned to Melanie Klein or Freudians like that, and they seem to idealize Freudians. Or neo-Freudians. That's tragic. In my view, that's a theoretical regression back away from Jung's pioneering, brilliant understanding. So to make everything simple, again, smile at me and keep a sense of humor, this is the 190 proof truth. And that is that I call it the dragon because people have domesticated the word God. I'll talk about that tomorrow night. And trivialized it. It's a principle in literary criticism called sedimentation. It means that you can have a new idea, but very quickly you get bored with it. Whenever you feel boredom, sedimentation is occurring because nothing is really boring. And if you feel bored, your mind is sort of getting distracted and sedimenting. Do you follow that? Can you think about that just a minute? I want you to think about that, because it happens to all of us. All of us have a tendency to get bored. You know, the one of the things that always is a great mystery to me is how quickly people become bored with themselves. One of the problems in being a psychotherapist, this is a practical problem of being a psychotherapist. People have a hard time standing anybody really being that interested in them. I'm serious. I really mean that literally. And so, when I'm working with someone, I have to be very careful how intensely I communicate that I'm really paying attention. Why? Because there's this mechanism in our psyche. I'll give you the $500 word for it. It's a defense against the numinous. It means that whenever you get close to realizing the presence of this big solar source in your psyche, you start getting really anxious. The most toxic anxiety comes from an unconscious realization by your ego. Your ego can tell that you're getting close to knowing too much right then about the big energy in the psyche. Now think about that a minute. I don't want to rush past that. You need to really stay with me on this and try to resist the tendency to yawn. If you yawn, I get it. I totally get it because it's all overwhelming. But just keep a sense of humor with me. We defend against realizing that there's this huge thing. I like to say it's got 220,000 volts of energy. And we're trying to plug in a coffee maker. Think about that a minute. I really mean that. I really mean that. That's the way it is. Yeah, that's right. That's funny. And it is funny. And it is true. And so we spend a great deal of our psychic energy not knowing. Seeking not to know. Why? I mean, is that something that you ought to give up? Absolutely not. Why? Because if you were to stop having the ability to not take that in, and if you, in other words, tomorrow night I'll talk about what is really possible in terms of really taking in the truth of that without being psychotic. But that's spirituality. The psychological understanding that Jung had was that there has to be a conscious, ongoing relationship formed between your I and the great self, what he called the archetypal self. That is the key to your individuation. If there was a way to summarize what the individuation, that is coming to the fullness of your self-realization, it is in Jung's mind, and he was and is right about this, that you got to befriend the big thing. And you got to get better at being a friend of it. If you will, let me just say, this is the key to Jungian psychology and Jungian analysis, real Jungian analysis. not post-Jungian stuff, because those people are not Jungians. But a real Jungian, classical Jungian, or even a Neo-Jungian like me or Anthony Stevens, who is one of my, who I consider to be, whose work is similar to mine. Maybe better in many ways, but we are kind of in the same zip code. But Edinger was the one. Jung, in classical Jungian psychology, there's a lot of sort of cultivation of mystery about the great self. And Jung himself even had a hesitation about, he didn't think you ought to try to know too much about the great self. He was, bear with me here for a second, keep your sense of humor. Jung was a Kantian follower of Immanuel Kant in philosophy. And anybody who is a follower of Immanuel Kant, as Jung was, has the assumption that you can't know the thing in itself. So Jung's Kantian assumptions led him to really doubt that you could come to really knowing the big it. He believed that it was really possible, though, for you to, in your individuation process, if you're fiercely committed to it, that you could get to the point, hopefully in this lifetime, so that you could dwell in the presence of the big self. He was right about that. That's the truth. That was big, capital T truth of Jung's breakthrough. But what happened with a lot of the classical Jungians, Maria Louise von Franz, and a number of other folks in the classical camp, they seem to have kind of gotten bored with that idea of Jung's, and they did not continue to focus on the radical centrality of that ego archetypal self-axis for self-realization. And so you can read a lot of these classical Jungian authors, and they never talk about the big it. Now, there may be many reasons why they didn't, but the fact is that many of them lost track of that. Just like the Freudians, the so-called post-Freudians, really lost track of Freud's assumption about the primacy of the it. On Freud's deathbed, he reiterated that it's all about the it. It's all about the it. And in that way, Freud and Jung are much closer than the psychological tribalists want us to believe. You know, tribalism is worse in psychology. I'm serious. It's worse in psychology than it is in religion, and it's horrific in religion. So you got to keep a sense of humor if you're studying psychology or if you're around a psychologist. Like we said last night, you know, folks really want to believe they're right. I mean, exclusively right, you know. So there again, there's where you need your sense of humor. Okay. So, now, so a lot of Jungians got very bored apparently got bored with the concept of the big it, the great self within. I tell you, one of the ones that I love so much, and if I got you to read anybody, in addition to Jung, it would be the great Edward Edinger. Especially his book, Ego and Archetype. Because Edinger, even though contemporary Jungians love to dismiss him as being passé, in my view, he was the one that really got what Jung was talking about and has written about it in extremely clear ways. Edinger is like a rabbi. He operates like a rabbi. He's not a systematic theoretician like I try to be. And he doesn't need to be. But a rabbi will take a text and he will stay with that text and work on it and work on it and work on it until he can try to see the sort of key essence of a text, spiritual essence. Edinger was like that with Jung's text. And so he is a master expositor of Jung's writing. So if you don't do anything else, and you just take away from me that you need to kind of snuggle up to Edward Edinger, and he'll be the gift that keeps on giving. And he will not lead you astray about this reality. Now, I want to add one thinker. Have any of you heard of Heinz Kohut? Kohut. Most of you have not. He was this brilliant person that founded what's known today as psychoanalytic self-psychology. And here was the guy in the Freudian tradition who, after Jung, later than Jung, he came back and he was the one who made the great breakthrough in understanding narcissistic pathology. In other words, Heinz Kohut. See, even classical Jungians would tend, and still do tend, not to have much empathy for people who are inflated. We tend to be a little bit judgmental of people who are inflated, especially if they're severely inflated. You know, come into your office and want to shine. You know, a person that's real narcissistically wounded will try to come in, and if you're trustworthy and they sense they can trust you, they will show you their, what Kohut called, the grandiose exhibitionistic self-organization. Now, don't run off now. Stay with me on that. Kohut, here's this guy coming out of the Freudian tradition, brilliant. He was so worshipped by the Freudians. I once went to a conference, big room, twice, 2 or 3 times as big as this, and it was full of Freudian psychoanalysts. And when Heinz Kohut walked in the room, big, tall, handsome, white-haired guy at that time, he walks in the room and he starts walking down the aisle, and you would have thought Jesus Christ had just walked in that room. The energy was amazing. I mean, they got as quiet you could hear a pin drop because they had an idealizing projection on Heinz Kohut. We Jungians would say they projected on Kohut the perfection of an idealized, what we call in psychoanalysis, an idealizing transference. I gave lectures one time called Idealization and Evil, because there's a part of us, especially the little child part of us, that really needs to idealize somebody. And that child part of us needs to have somebody hold our idealization good enough, well enough. Because that is the way that we seek to connect with the gold, the God reality. Think about that now. I'm not going to rush you. I want you to think about that. So, in other words, when he walked in that room, what Anne-Marie Rizzuto, one of those self-psychologists, came to call the living God, the projection of the living God, psychological God, the idealization on him. And, hey, I get it. He deserved a lot of admiration because it was through his work, after Jung, that actually moved us all toward the possibility of loving someone who is suffering from a narcissistic personality disorder. If you don't know what a narcissistic personality disorder is, you Google it, because you know a lot of them. Some of you may meet them in the mirror every day. But it is a distinct, I'll show you in a little bit. How much time do we have left, Rose?
We have 15 minutes.
Okay. Hoop-de-doo. I got 15 minutes. Okay. So Kohut actually enabled us, paradoxically, to be able to appreciate Jung's revolution better, because it just underscores how radically correct Jung was to understand the importance of inflation. Kohut actually taught me, because I was very fortunate, my psychoanalyst wife, Margaret, had the privilege of studying and being supervised by Ernest Wolff, who was Heinz Kohut's right hand, and maybe the most understandable writer of that tradition. Margaret had the opportunity to study with Ernest Wolff and be supervised by him, and I learned all that I know about Kohut and his self-psychology because of Margaret. I tried to be a good student. I think I've been pretty good as a student of Kohut. And the key point there is simply we have to get to where we can have a person who's really arrogant. That's a narcissistic personality disorder. A really arrogant person, and we have to accept the challenge of not hating them. I want you to think about that. A lot of therapists hate them. A lot of therapists cannot stand being in a room with them. And the interesting thing about patients in psychotherapy, they can always tell in their gut what you really think of them. And they can always tell whether you have good intention toward them and empathy or not. A therapist can't hide it. Okay. So now I just wanted to take 2 or 3 minutes to just tell you one concept that I have created with the help of Heinz Kohut to move my point of view from being a classical Jungian to what I call a Neo-Jungian. And that is the understanding that in your psyche, there are not 2 centers but three. There's the center, the God within, that's the archetypal self. It is all-knowing. And it is complete in itself. It's complete. It is full. It is abundant. And it is the seat of the blueprint for your individuation. And what I call the code for your psychological development resides in that archetypal self. So that's the great center. And I've said to you that, just a minute. Oh, you can't hear me? Okay. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me. I get overstimulated, see? And so here's the deal. The second center I mentioned, it's the ego, the center of your subjective awareness. But Kohut enabled us to think about the fact that there is an actual organizational center in your psyche that's not the ego consciousness. Kohut called it the nuclear self with a little s. That means a organization in your psyche that you're not born with and actually has to be evoked. And it actually has to be nurtured. So in other words, not everyone has a nuclear self. You don't come with a nuclear self. You don't come with a little s self that is solid and workable. That has to be, the potential for that has to be evoked. It has to be blessed. And there have to be people. Stay with me now. Stay with me. I'm almost done. It has to be nurtured by relationships, loving, available, emotionally available, ongoing, nurturing relationships. Without that, without ongoing, nurturing, heart-connected, loving relationships, the little organizational self does not form. All of us have the potential to form what Kohut called, and what I agree, you'll see in my diagrams, is you have the potential to form a really cohesive little s self. That we will be talking about more tomorrow night. That is the inner temple. It's in my diagrams. I just want to refer to that one diagram, and then we can kick it around in our discussion period. This one here, the one that says the path of individuation toward optimal personality. It's page 8. Thank you. Now, if you carefully meditate on that diagram, your right brain will get it. Because these diagrams in this catalog are a distillation of the essence of my findings. The first 4 stages represent Edinger's work. That's Edinger's work. He understood that in the early part of life, the big task is to differentiate yourself from the dragon. That you can't stay unconsciously merged with the dragon. Stay with me on that thought now. The task in early life is to gain the insight and get the help you need to differentiate your I from the it, from the big it. Now think about that and hold that in your mind for a minute, and we're almost done for now. So you can read Edinger's Ego and Archetype for an understanding of that first four circles. The fifth, sixth, and seventh are my work, my movement to another understanding of the what I call the system self. So there are three centers in your psyche. The great self, which is the archetypal self. It's the God imago in you. Always has been in you. You, as you see in those diagrams, you came out of your ego. Your ego came out of it, out of that big circle. The little dark circle is your potential differentiated I. But when you're a child, you don't know the difference between you and the it. And as you get older through adolescence and hopefully coming into adulthood, the goal is to develop what Edinger called the ego archetypal self-axis. That's a fancy word. It's not to represent, it doesn't tell you really what it is. That's the friendship, the respectful. When you get to the point when you can be clear that you are not it in a simplistic way. And gross narcissistic grandiosity and acting out is always a phenomenon and a manifestation of not getting that. So when you're really regressed into your particular form of grandiosity, we all have our favorite route to regress into our grandiosity. And it will always be a possibility. And if I had more time, which hopefully one day I will be able to teach you this stuff in more detail, but I'll guarantee you, you have a favorite way, a favorite pathway on which you regress into your grandiosity. So the goal, and this is where Edinger leaves it, the ego, archetypal self, conscious connection. Differentiation and conscious connection. But the great Erich Neumann, a brilliant Israeli Jungian analyst, whose work is fabulous. He wrote a book. He wrote many books, but he wrote this amazing book that put on your reading list. It's called The Origins and History of Consciousness. And in that book, he lays out the reality that I'm simply updating with more recent evidence and more contemporary language, that after you get differentiated, the process doesn't stop there. You need to reconnect consciously to the great self, and you need to develop carefully, respectfully, the capacity to enter into it again. And so the final stage of individuation for Edinger, and he lays it out in that Origins and History of Consciousness, is to reconnect with what Edinger thinks of as the great goddess, the archetypal mother. That is a primal classical Jungian way to say it, and it's not wrong. But I always have to remind people there's also an archetypal father that you need to to learn to dwell in too. So anyway, Neumann, Origins and History of Consciousness, he did not have the benefit of being able to learn from Heinz Kohut, so he never talked about the little s self, or what I call the system self in your personality. That cup, you see that? That's the psychological chalice. That cup, the formation of that cup, is the psychological Holy Grail. Because it's the psychological Holy Grail. Because if you do not form that cup of the little s self to hold all this archetypal energy consciously, then you will not be able to stand all of its power. And you will have to go away from it. Or you will get really sick, really crazy. So in other words, one needs to develop this potential to have an inner vessel into an actual capacity. When I'm talking with you in these days, you have to have the capacity to contain and channel all of this God energy consciously. And if you cannot have that capacity, you won't be able to hold much God energy in your psyche without fragmenting. Let me say that again. And then I'm gonna stop for now, and we'll take a break. On those last three images there in that diagram, the formation of the system self as an actual capacity in the complex adaptive system of your personality, an actual capacity, that is the actual psychological formation of the cup of transformation, imaged spiritually in the cup of the Eucharist, and imaged in myth as the Holy Grail. But it can be spoken about scientifically. Everything I'm telling you now, I can argue without referring to anything divine. I've got my psychoanalytic scientist hat on now. If you understand systems theory, you can actually lay out scientifically what I just said. So I know that that's a lot, but I want us to dialogue about that. So, what is possible? We're going to talk about a lot tomorrow night. Those three diagrams at the end there, the fifth, sixth, and seventh circle, that's what you really have the potential to do. It's really possible for you to develop such a secure inner vessel that you can more and more, like Eric Neumann taught, that more and more you can take refuge in the heart of the archetypal self, the God within. Think about that a minute. It is really possible, psychologically, to get to the point where you can dwell consciously in the archetypal self. and have a loving relationship with it. Tomorrow night, I'm going to take off my psychoanalytic scientist hat, and I'm going to put on my crazy spiritual theologian hat. And I'm going to say the same thing to you in theological and spiritual terms, because it's two sides of the same coin. They have to be seen as this. So that's a lot to take into, but that's where we're going. So I hope you get that I'm giving you the psychological gospel, good news, because very few psychologies really think that's possible for you. But Jung knew it was. And I'm just trying to articulate it with contemporary resources. So I want to thank you very much. We're going to take a break now for 10 minutes. Thank you very much. And come back and we'll discuss.
Oh, yeah. We can go to 9 or whatever.
Take a few deep breaths. That'll help you regulate the anxiety that I just caused by pouring all this stuff into your psyche. And keep a sense of humor, because there's no way you could master that in that length of time. So I don't really expect you to have been able to do that. And yet, everything I said to you is true about my Jungian and Neo-Jungian theory. And so it's all in those diagrams, and God willing, inshallah, as the Islamic people say, God willing, I might have an opportunity to go deeper into it with more adequate time. I'm a professor. I was a professor for over 40 years, and I had at least 3 hours at a time for 10 sessions, 30 hours. But now you have an opportunity, and remember, there are elaborate hundreds of hours of lectures that make this more detailed, unpack it in more detail. It's all there, available through the website. So if I have managed to stir any interest, you're not going to have any problem finding the material. And then if you'll pray for me and send me energy, because my old battery doesn't hold the charge very much these days. But if you'll pray for me and send me energy, actually this series of books may actually be in print, and then you can just curl up with a drink and read it. So anyway, I want to open it up. We have our people with mics. Rose has a mic, and I'd like you to stand up. Say your name and ask your question.
Hello, Doctor. Exactly that same thing that you're asking for, prayer, is what I was going to ask about in relationship to what you were talking about with the id and the ego, and how, in your opinion, it might have some effects.
What's it got to do with prayer? Well, in Jung's idea, there was fundamentally dream interpretation. Right. Every dream is a special delivery letter to you from the big it. Jung said, the archetypal self, the dragon I call it, turns the face to you that you turn to it. So if it sends you a dream, it meant for you to pay attention to it, to respect. That's the least. We'll talk tomorrow night. The least you can do, the first thing that's the most important thing to do is to show respect to it. Because if you don't show respect to it, it tends to turn its war face toward you. And the trickster archetype will constellate and teach you how to respect, teach you respect by having you lose your car keys or leave your Visa card somewhere that you can't remember where. Got me the other day. I went to the bank. Bank called me. Hey, we have your Visa. So I know I was a little inflated and grandiose. And that just kind of said, hey, watch it, Robert, watch it. So that dream interpretation, especially delivery letters, and Jung actually thought that active imagination dialogues were even more powerful than dreams as a resource for developing that friendship. So there's a lot of stuff out there on active imagination, and many of you are probably experts on it. You probably facilitate guided meditations and visualizations all over the place down here. I know I'm preaching to the choir. But this man has a great question, and it's one that doesn't get addressed much. You want to have a loving relationship with it, need to learn how to pray. Because, if you pray, now I keep my scientist hat on now. If you pray, you're cultivating the friendship. Psychologically speaking, you're cultivating a conscious friendship with the big it. So prayer is not often talked about by many Jungian analysts, but some talk about it a lot. I admire the great Ann Ulanov a great deal, New York City analyst. I admire her a great deal, and you can look at her books. Ann Ulanov, she's got great books on women. She's got a fabulous book on envy that you all ought to read, but you have to read it slowly because it's so painful. It's called Cinderella and Her Sisters. Because, to the extent that you show your gold, people are going to envy and hate you. So, prayer. It's the rapid way to develop a conscious, loving relationship with the big it. So, thank you for that. You're absolutely on target. Another?
Yes. My question is, could you expound a little bit more on the active imagination?
Active imagination?
Yes. What exactly is that?
Well, let me give you a great reference by the great Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson has been a fabulous resource for people like you for many, many, many years. For many years, Robert and I taught at the Southeastern Jungian Spirituality Conference called the Journey into Wholeness. I don't know whether you ever heard of that. But his book, Inner Work, it is basic, it's readable, it's understandable, and it gives you instructions. I'll put it in a nutshell. In active imagination, you actually can write for your ego, for your I, in your journal. And then you can write for the great it with your left hand. Or you can put it with your laptop. You can put your thoughts in lowercase. And then you can ask it what it has to say, and then you can type what it has to say in caps. Now, if you haven't never done this, it sounds really weird. But you know, I have conducted complete analysis with people in which I really didn't do any therapy. I simply sought to open up a trusting space, and they did active imagination with the great self. It says when you try, it says a lot of things that are much more brilliant than I could ever say. So that's what active imagination is. And the good news is you can read Robert Johnson, and he gives you the ABCs in a really true way. Other questions, comments? Back here.
My question is kind of the relationship with what you're saying with things like the Myers-Briggs and Enneagrams.
Okay.
Not that I'm refuting them, but it feels like, in a way, that, okay, whatever one's type is with any of those things, that this is something that is like Prometheus bound or something. You're bound by these things and you can't escape them. And maybe you don't want to escape them, I don't know.
Can you all hear him? He's asking about Myers-Briggs typology and Enneagram reading, you know, you're what you are on the Enneagram. But you didn't really say your question. What is your question about that?
My question is those well, maybe it's an observation, but those things feel like one is tied in or imprisoned by something, which is my issue. Maybe.
I think I see an implicit question.
Okay, good. Maybe you can tell me what it is, and I'd appreciate it.
I think what your question is do I need to camp out in my Myers-Briggs type and live there forever? Well, depends on how you understand individuation. This is parallel to those people who say, find your myth. You remember any of those? Find your myth that you're living and just live it to the fullest. Well, I think what you got to do is to become conscious about what myth you're living and let the great self liberate you from that cul-de-sac. So that's what you're implicitly asking. Am I trapped? At the fundamental level, am I trapped by my type or my Enneagram number or by my myth I'm unconsciously living? I can just tell you my opinion. You got to be liberated from those things. They are way stations on your journey. And they're worthy way stations. If I had more time to teach you, I would show you how that's also true. You know, most of us could be diagnosed with a psychopathology if somebody wanted to do it. You know, when I was young, if it moved, I diagnosed it. And I got really good. I used to teach advanced courses in advanced diagnosis. And I learned from the great Theodore Milan, who was the most scientific and the best of them. But healing is not going to come out of putting you in a label. Now, If you were really trained in psychotherapy, you could diagnose me at the drop of a hat, and you'd probably be right. But here again, you got to keep a sense of humor. Because if there's a therapist that's trying to communicate to you that you are borderline, you've always been a borderline, you'll always be a borderline, and there's not really any hope for you, and there are a lot of therapists like that, get a new therapist. Because they really don't know what they're talking about. So, another back here. Somebody else. Anybody over here? I've been looking over this way. Anybody over here that's got a question? I'll take one more question tonight. And tomorrow night, I'm going to put my spiritual theologian hat on, my theologian of the ecstatic spirit hat. And I'm going to shamelessly talk about all this from the point of view of spiritual life. So I'm old, so I can be honest. Finally. Okay? So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm just going to talk about this from the spiritual perspective. But one more question, and then I'll let you folks get some rest.
This may not be the... So with regards to what you're going to speak about tomorrow night, then could you give us some insight about how we might integrate your scientific perspective that you gave us tonight with your spiritual perspective that we're going to get tomorrow night?
I intend to, but you're going to have to keep a sense of humor.
Okay. Can we wear both hats at the same time?
I'll tell you what I consider to be the end. She's asking about how I might talk to you about how the scientific frame that I just gave you relates to a spiritual view that I want to give you tomorrow night. There are two sides of the same coin. In my view, they're talking about the exact same truth. One, so you can't really integrate scientific psychology and, we could say existential theology and spirituality. You can't, because it's two different perspectives on the same diamond. But it's the diamond where the integration is. What the Buddhists call, and I'll talk about some tomorrow night, the diamond body, the God imago. That's where it's integrated. But you shouldn't collapse scientific psychology and spirituality, because that's very naive. Because they have different assumptions. The things I talked to you about tonight, I don't need any revelation to argue that with anybody that is interested in evidence. You see what I mean? But what I'm going to tell you about tomorrow night, to answer your question, in my view, it's all about the diamond within. So the scientific perspective I just gave you, I think is accurate. I think it draws on more scientific evidence, multiple disciplines, than any other point of view out there. But you know what? All psychological systems, you know the difference between a jet and a rocket, a jet engine and a rocket engine? Well, a jet engine has to have oxygen in the atmosphere, and it can fly only so high before it can't go any higher. That's the way psychology is. By definition, psychology can only just take you to a certain altitude. That's not a flaw. That's all it can do. By definition, it can only take you to a certain altitude of intellectual understanding. Spirituality, if it's really integrative, which it needs to be, spirituality is like a rocket engine. And it can take you out of the gravitational pull of the world that you live in. So that's how to understand it. So tonight we did the jet engine thing. We climbed up to maybe 40,000 feet, you know, but the air's getting really thin up there. Not too much oxygen. Tomorrow night we'll gain a little more altitude than that. Okay? That's what I'm going to try to offer you. But keep a sense of humor. It's going to be just as difficult as tonight, but you don't have to master it tonight or tomorrow night. But everything I'm going to tell you, I think is true. And so, even if you just get it a bit, that's an achievement. And we'll celebrate it. So anyway, have a good night's sleep. And I will see you folks tomorrow evening.
Thank you, Dr. Moore.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.